So hello everyone, welcome to Integral Live. My name is Corey DeVos. I am the editor-in-chief and general man behind the curtain at Integral Life. I'm really happy you guys could all join us today. I'm here today with our very good longtime friend and partner in evolution, Terry Patton. Terry's been a dear friend and family member of the Integral Project for, basically as long as I have, for the last 15 years or so at least. And Terry's going to be doing a monthly show with us here on the Integral Live platform, where he's going to be looking at the concept of integral or sacred activism, how to better align our walk with our talk, would be one way that I would put it. Terry, how you doing, buddy? I'm so glad you could be here with us today.
I'm great. Thanks, Corey. Happy to be beyond all technical matters and here with you and everybody else.
Fantastic. Well, just before we begin, I just want to let everyone know what's going to happen here is Terry's going to offer his full presentation, and then we're going to open it up to Q&A afterwards. So if you have any questions or comments that you'd like to share with Terry, there's two ways you can do that. First off, if you're watching on integrallife.com/live, there's a link right underneath your video player. If you click that, that'll bring you into the Zoom app. It might be a quick download, but it's totally free. Once you're in the Zoom app, you'll have two ways of interacting with us. You can either raise your hand. There's a button you can press that'll raise your hand. That'll let us know that you have a question, you want us to call on you, and we'll turn on your camera and your audio so you can ask your question in real time. Or you can press the Q&A button at the very bottom of the screen if you just want to submit a written question, and then we'll read that on the air, and then Terry will, take your question that way. So two ways of engaging. We hope you've got some good questions and comments. We've already got a great question that we'll lead with as soon as Terry's done with his main presentation, which begins now.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Thanks so much, Corey. I'm here to talk in a way about a whole series of topics that I treat in some depth in my book that's about to be released from North Atlantic Books, A New Republic of the Heart, an ethos for revolutionaries. And it's about a 350-page, fairly deep treatment of a variety of topics. It goes pretty deeply into the nature of our current moment, particularly being willing to face what I think that as a culture we've more or less almost universally decided to abstract ourselves from, the severity and daunting implications of our ecological predicament, particularly embodied by global warming, but really the climate change is only one face of something more fundamental. And recognizing it actually as an evolutionary driver, as this problem is actually a point of initiation, like a spiritual initiation, like Shaktipat from a awakened Kundalini guru. It's in the process of waking us up culturally in profound ways. And some of us can wake up before the emergencies that are created by the climate crisis get too extreme. And then it takes a look in a pretty deep way at the fundamental principles at work. Essentially, those of us who are students of Ken's theory, this eros, this drive for integration, can be thought of as a drive toward wholeness. The wholeness, which is the substrate, the foundation of everything, the nature of every moment, is also trying to enact itself in time and space. And yet our self-accelerating process of cultural evolution is creating tremendously powerful fragmenting patterns. So we're all subject to daily news feed that is causing many of the people that I know to feel a kind of confusion. On the one hand, it's like, whoa, things are getting intense here. The alarm is sounding, all hands on deck. Okay, I want to be a part of that solution. I want to embody the health of everything good, true, and beautiful. I want to enact that here in the world. How do I do that? And the particular things that we can do are always addressing a particular narrower piece of this whole, whereas our conceptual capacity recognizes that whole system change is necessary, that an integral transformative shift is required. But all of our actions that we can take are woefully small by comparison to the size of the dynamic. And so it's producing a kind of quality of dread, a sense of helplessness, a sense of being made inauthentic morally. So the book explores that in a pretty deep way. Now, let me back up for a second and introduce myself a little bit more thoroughly. My personal journey is probably best understood if I tell you some things about my childhood. When I was 6 years old, my parents moved into a place called the York Center Community Co-op. It was about 20 miles west of the city of Chicago. There were cornfields all around at that time. It's now actually closer to the Loop than the very center geographically of the greater Chicagoland area. So it's completely part of that suburban slurb now. But at the time, it was the country. I went to a one-room schoolhouse for first grade. And the York Center Community Co-op had been founded by members of a church called the Church of the Brethren, one of the peace churches in America, like the Quakers and the Mennonites. And it decided that according to their principles of peace and brotherhood, which were the core of how they lived their religion, they were going to invite people of other races, which was a pretty radical thing to do in the late 40s, and religions to join together with them to live as a community devoted to peace and brotherhood. So by the time my family moved there in the 50s, I grew up, and then my growing up was mostly in the 60s, with all these aunts and uncles who were Japanese Americans who had spent the Second World War in internment camps, and conscientious objectors who had spent the war in prison or doing very prescribed service, or old labor organizers, even one unrepentant communist, although most of them were really more liberals. And so I was raised going to peace vigils and civil rights marches and being mentored to kind of be a political activist. So I was very involved. As a high school student, I got involved in Students for a Democratic Society. I was the regional coordinator for SDS. I was also involved with the Chicago area draft resistors. I went off to the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor and led a couple of demonstrations that took over the LSNA building and North Hall, the ROTC building, led a march on the president's residence there, President Fleming, over divestment in apartheid South Africa. And I particularly remember one incident when I was leading that particular march. I looked up at a second-story window and I saw a woman seeing all these, whatever it was, 4,000 or 5,000 students surging around the house, shouting. So we were chanting something about divestment in South Africa, and she was just feeling under assault. She pulled a shade in order just not to be visible to this kind of hostile crowd. And it really struck me how if I was to be involved in any kind of social change, I had to become a more mature being. That it wasn't really true that we had all the answers, that in fact we were obviously arrogant adolescents who had a lot to learn, and that if I was going to make a better world, the revolution had to begin with me. And so that kind of led me gradually over the course of several years into the human potential movement, into being a resident fellow at a place sort of like Esalen in Canada's West Coast, and then to an ashram where I found my longtime spiritual teacher, Adi Da, and I spent 15 years deeply involved in the inner work, with the sense that there really had to be a revolution in consciousness if we were going to create a different world. That, in the famous quote that's often attributed to Albert Einstein, the kinds of problems that we're facing can't really be solved with the kind of consciousness that created them, that a different kind of consciousness is necessary. And after 15 years of deep involvement with spiritual practice, I began to see the necessity of a more integral perspective. I got involved with the integral, literature during the time I was building a consciousness technologies company. I spent about 10 years doing that. And then I found my way to working with Ken at Integral Institute and helping design integral life practice. That's kind of how I got here. So for me, the sense that any legitimate spirituality had to express itself in a social stand, it had to be lived, was kind of bred into me, even as a child growing up. And over time, having, in a sense, questioned and even temporarily rejected that premise, I've come to feel that it's actually more relevant than ever, and actually super relevant in our time in a whole profound way that's not ordinarily fully appreciated. And therefore, the other thing that has happened during these years, which I think everybody is at least abstractly aware of, is that our, a whole variety of social and economic and political challenges, cultural challenges, have been involved in a kind of self-intensifying, self-accelerating crescendo. And that has had a fragmenting effect on all of us as a political whole, as a social whole, and even individually in our psyches. We're affected by that fragmenting dynamic. So that fragmentation is in tension, though, with this other dimension of ourselves, which is a kind of inherent wholeness wanting to reassert itself. The wholeness of our beings, the wholeness that is expressed. For instance, the foundations of any true spirituality express a profound and deep awakening from the sense of dilemma, the sense of problem. If it exists, if it is what is, it inherently can't be a problem. And yet, at the same time, we can see that the human species has overpopulated the planet in terms of what we know are the proven carrying capacities of the planet. And we do see that, there were a variety of projections that were offered by the people who did the most systematic attempt to do an analysis in the 70s, particularly the authors of the landmark book, Limits to Growth. They identified for global warming, even the early IPCC projections had a projected path of growth of carbon emissions and planetary temperatures and extreme weather events. And then there was a best case scenario and a worst case scenario. And since those projections began long enough ago, we can now see that the actual measurements are tracking significantly worse than what were earlier thought to be the worst case projections. We're actually in a situation in which the particulars are always impossible to attribute simply and directly to climate change, to the greenhouse effect, to global weirding, as it's sometimes called. It's not just warming, it's weirding of our weather patterns. But for us to download and actually feel, not just abstractly talk about, but take into account the full implications of that situation is almost impossibly disorienting. And I've contemplated that quite a bit. There's a concept I first found out about it when I was, I think, a freshman maybe in college. There was a landmark book by Charles Tart called Altered States of Consciousness, and he introduced the idea of the consensus trance. Having studied altered states of consciousness, and particularly hypnotic states, he took a look at what goes on in the socialization of a child, and he realized that there's a pretty systematic inculcation of a state of consciousness that is effectively a trance. It admits certain realities and excludes other perceptions and realities, and that therefore we're conditioned together into a way of seeing reality that has certain limits. And that metaphor has been very helpful to me in understanding the odd incapacity of even some of the most awake and enlightened thinkers to fully download the implications of our current knowledge of our ecological situation. If it is true that technological advances are potentially going to reach exponential advance, and at the point where there's a super intelligence, for example, there may be profound technological advances thought up by that super intelligence that can, for instance, help us find a completely free source of energy, or perhaps actually capture carbon already in the atmosphere and even sequester it, perhaps in the soil or the earth. It's possible, but we have to defy a lot of patterns. The concentrated energy is pretty rare in the universe, and the particularly concentrated energy that's found in the earth is mostly found in various kinds of fossil fuels and uranium. There aren't too many sources of that kind of concentrated energy. The idea that we're going to definitely find it is, you know, if we just take what's known, we're on a collision course with a pretty unfriendly, human unfriendly planetary conditions. And the implications of that are very, very destructive fires, very, very destructive floods, much worse than what we saw in Houston or in Santa Rosa this past year. And an intensifying pattern of them, creating even worse refugee flows than those that disrupted the politics of the Middle East and Europe in this last couple of years. That seems to be written in to the climate future. And that will have impacts not just on migration, but on politics and society and on our financial system that are potentially so devastating that they almost uproot and threaten to thwart all of the positive evolutionary trends that we are also seeing. On the other hand, the good news is going to be profoundly disruptive too. And therefore, wonderful emergence that radically change aspects of society are going to inevitably come into being, and they're going to interpose themselves with these negative disruptions in a pattern that's very, very hard to predict. And because it's so hard to predict, all we can know is everything will change, and we will change. And our ways of being, our ways of knowing how to be, can't prepare us for, they can only prepare us to be willing, open-hearted, awake participants in a world in which, whoa, all kinds of wild, unpredictable changes will take place. Many predictable elements, but how they're going to roll, we don't know. One of the worst fires of this last summer burned several houses that I had previously lived in, and a couple of the fires from previous years they burned a cabin that I owned and the homes of about 24 of my friends in a place that I had formerly lived. I also saw a hurricane hit an island that a lot of my friends lived on. The reality that these changes will potentially, there's no particularly safe place to hide. If we let that land, it means that something of the pattern of thinking we know what reality is, and that the best predictor historically of tomorrow's weather is it's likely to be pretty close to today's weather. Yesterday's weather, today's weather, tomorrow's weather, sort of the same. And yet all bets are off about that. And how do we shrug off the blinders that the consensus trance has us in? There's a society-wide denial of this, even among people who are discussing global warming as if they are facing it. The tendency is to talk about it as an objective, technical issue, that we, as we are, knowers, sort of in that independent, objective position in relation to the pattern, can simply analyze and look at the pattern and imagine how it will, play out. I'm quite impressed right now. There's an important new book by Steven Pinker, Enlightenment Now, which expands on the thesis of his previous book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, and which talk eloquently and with tremendous amounts of specific detail about how profoundly positively modernity has transformed the human world, and how almost every marker of violence and suffering has been radically improved across the last 500 years by the advance of reason. And it's a passionate defense of the important foundational shared agreement that modern reason gives us as a basis for going forward. And I'm pretty sympathetic to that as an integralist. The deconstruction of knowledge by postmodernity, it's a pretty big problem that we all have to deal with. But the way that Pinker talks about the ecological predicament fails to account for just how profoundly it's going to disrupt his world and his life. Life in the United States of America is going to be pretty profoundly affected if we have to build enormous levees around the whole state of Florida in order to keep it from being submerged, and if it's breached periodically by ridiculous storms. If we have the same kind of situation with most of our other coastal cities, if we have intensification of world conflict because of mass migrations of refugees, if we have failures of the insurance system because we have so many uninsurable losses, even in the first world, it's a daunting series of challenges. How can we stop being in denial of all that and truly rest in the unconditional happiness that is the very nature of any kind of spiritual wisdom and sanity? Well, that riddle has kind of propelled me into this consideration. And my beginning of my presentation is mainly to invite you to feel into this, because this isn't, many considerations are ones that can be analyzed. And this one, it's an invitation actually to recognize the ways that we're immunizing ourselves from feeling some of these implications. We kind of have to climb into it, since we love our kids and care about the possibilities of life for our grandkids and their grandkids, since we care about the future of life and biodiversity on the planet. The implications of our collective predicament are pretty daunting. So I'm hoping that we're gonna find our way into a different kind of discourse that's kind of disarmed, vulnerable, and that draws us into a felt engagement with these questions that goes beyond, that includes a rigorous, intellectually sophisticated analysis, but goes beyond it to be an existential and therefore spiritually fragrant confrontation with these realities. So I think that gets us started in this conversation, Corey. And yeah, I'd love to hear any thoughts that come up for you immediately in response to that.
Yeah, well, first off, thank you. That was really fantastic. A few things that I really appreciated in your presentation, Terry. First off, I appreciated you telling us your sort of personal background. Not only sort of, the journey that brought you here, which helps us all get to know you better, but, particularly around kind of the sadness, the despair around, you have homes that were, previous places that you've lived that were, consumed by the various fires in California, and Keith Witt has similar stories. And, as sort of sad as those stories are, as really, traumatizing as those stories can be, I think the silver lining for me is that this great, big, abstract, impersonal problem of climate change is now getting personalized, right? We're actually starting to feel that pressure in our lives in a real way. We're starting to feel how this impacts, how this intersects with society, with our own livelihood, with our, our love for our friends and our families. And, we've sort of hit that tipping point in this story where we're starting to feel these effects. I mean, anyone who's been paying attention to what continues to happen in Puerto Rico, your heart breaks.
Right.
And sort of one of the things that really draws me to Integral is developing the capacity to at once have your heart so full and yet so broken at the same time. Which for me feels like sort of, ground zero for any kind of integral activism. You really have to feel sort of both sides of that ledger, yeah?
Absolutely. Ken often says it hurts more but bothers you less. That's his one-liner about what happens at higher levels is less of a buffer, less numbness. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, there's a container, particularly in terms of radical spiritual awakening. There's contact with the unconditional, with that which cannot be threatened. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, that which cannot be threatened wouldn't be threatened even by the horrible suffering and descending of the human world into a hell realm and the extinguishment of all mammals. Whatever our worst case scenario is, it can be pretty bad, and simply resorting to that radical level of comfort is it could easily function in a immature psyche as a basis for a spiritual bypass. I know that I can be okay no matter what, and therefore, everything you love still needs your active love, active caring, you might say, creative defense or creative advocacy for in living terms. That's right. And that's so what I find about this, and this is something I just want to share with you. I'll speak to you about it, Corey. On behalf of everybody. Like, this is something so intractable. It's like an impossible question. How can we, just individuals, maybe to some degree we can be thought leaders and we can have some educational influence, but it's a relatively small sphere of influence on the scale of the global culture and global politics and collective decision making at the level of the species. And yet, if this situation is what it is, there's kind of an alarm sounding, all hands on deck. We've got to begin to be the change in a different way than we have been now. It means that whatever we've been doing, even though in some respects I've been being the change in the ways I knew how to be the change for years, there's something more that's possible. If the whole thing is going to change, there'll be change in the seats every one of us are sitting in. It has to arrive systemically. The intelligence, the will, the care, the love, the compassion, the wisdom of the whole human species is distributed across all of us. So there are, and there are arguments going on in the public sphere about what that implies. Having written this book, I'm encountering some, I think, legitimate arguments, from people we would describe as green, postmodern, but that, people on the left who argue that spiritual and psychological growth are a bypass of a social commitment, that your desire to self-actualize and heal your wounds and awaken and be all that you can be is a kind of diversion from your responsibility to your human community, and actually doing things that make a difference here are the essential things. I just got an email from a brilliant guy, author of many books, who's arguing, the only thing that matters at this point is how I can convert a Republican into becoming a Democrat. How can I actually turn the tide of our collective decision making at the level of my national politics? Because yes, it's true that we can't solve our problems with the old kind of thinking and so forth and so on. You can go to that, but the more you're involved in these abstractions, the less you're out there actually participating, making volunteering, registering people to vote, putting pressure on Congress people, having an effect directly on the collective decision making.
Absolutely.
And that's what has to. Now, I think the invitation I'm interested to bring forward to you and everyone, to myself, frankly, is these are impossible questions, and an impossible question functions like a koan. Like if we don't get out of the question, we don't change the subject. Gee, there's something about this that puts a kind of pressure on me, and that tension is uncomfortable, and I don't want to feel that tension, and so I'm gonna catch the, whatever TV show. I'm gonna watch the next series of the latest cool TV series, or there are all kinds of things that we're doing that relieve the pressure. Or I'm just going to even get high, get drunk. There's so many things we can do. I'm just going to have a laugh with my friends. I'm going to be interested in other topics in culture that are more uplifting. I'm going to concentrate on how technology can accomplish this or that, but it's a more abstract consideration. It's more amusing, and it has a more uplifting kind of a feel. But I'm not saying we shouldn't pay attention to those questions, but I am saying that we shouldn't let anything distract us from this most fundamental, large question. Because if we stay in the pressure of that, it functions the same way that koan practice can function. In the classic traditional Rinzai system, Dogen would confront people with a question, and often koans are actually stories. They're more indirect, but the classic questions that make sense to a Western mind are questions like, what is the sound of one hand clapping? Or show me your original face, the one you had before your parents were born.
The big guns.
Yeah. And those are questions that just stop the mind. Mm-hmm. Show you the face I had before my parents were born. It just stops you. And I think that this question of, it seems, from a certain perspective, there's a very coherent postmodern analysis of our situation that is completely depressing. It is that we were simply impelled by raw urges toward dominance and toward comfort and toward status and all the kind of fundamental human urges. And that was why we adapted so well to an interest-bearing fiat currency that made our economy always have to be an expansionary one. And therefore, when we found a new continent, the Europeans found the continent that they had more technological advance and could conquer and claim. They had unlimited resources for a few hundred years. And then when we discovered fossil fuels and we could start burning them, and we had the Industrial Revolution. So we've lived in this exuberant era of unlimited resources for a good chunk of time. And we're all adapted to that. And we're going to continue to try to stay committed to that no matter what, even though we've reached peak oil and we're not going to be in that same expansionary situation for much longer. And so there's going to be all kinds of hell to pay in terms of societal disruption. And in the meantime, with, 7.5 billion and heading quickly to probably at least 9, we've way exceeded our planetary carrying capacity. We're depleting non-renewable resources, and we're actually reducing the ultimate carrying capacity of the planet. And there's going to be a collapse, and there's going to be a big die-off. And we don't know exactly how bad that gets or how benignly it can be navigated, but we got a lot of shit in the pipes, and that's just how it's going to be. That's the postmodern analysis.
Yep.
And there's a transhumanist rejoinder. The transhumanist rejoinder is the advance of technology has become, Moore's law, various other principles. The advance of technology it follows exponential advance, not arithmetic advance. And therefore, there are going to be solutions so mind-blowing to all our essential problems that we're going to unhook from these seemingly hardwired limits of our fossil fuel, stores and our, really, the availability of fossil fuels is not our limiting factor. It's the limits of our atmosphere and our oceans to absorb the carbon and the acidification of the carbonic acid that seem to be the limits. But in any case, the argument is that there will be technological fixes to all this. And even if there aren't, we'll make our way to Mars and to other planets, and we'll colonize, we'll find Earth-like planets somewhere, and human life will go on into an unknowable future.
I don't find myself very satisfied by that rejoinder.
Well, given how much I enjoy the natural world, a life encased in plastic and glass and metal doesn't seem very appealing.
What's the joke? I really like Earth. It's where I keep all my stuff.
Yeah, there you go.
Well, and Jared, the other thing I really appreciate you sort of foregrounding here is the invitation to step out of abstraction. Ken actually gave us a really, really wonderful distillation of the integral work, which he describes as wake up, grow up, clean up, show up. Now, interestingly, wake up, grow up, clean up, that's all your personal work. That's all your work largely in the upper left quadrant, some lower left too, but largely in the upper
and
left.
Upper right, yeah.
Yeah, sure. I mean, yeah, you can locate them wherever you want, but the idea is it's very personal to me. And along those lines, integral itself is phenomenally, integral thinkers tend to be phenomenally gifted at being able to frame a problem with incredible precision. Right? We are really good we look around the world and we use this map, this lens, and we, are able to locate where exactly these problems are. I think we're still lagging a little bit behind is coming up with the solutions or even proposing solutions. And that, I appreciate you basically framing this as when it comes to finding the solutions, that's largely a wisdom question, which in other words,
that's right.
There might not be as much sort of consensus around the types of solutions that we need as there is around framing the problems. We can all agree that these are the problems and here, but when it comes to the question of what's to be done, that's almost just as personal of a question as anything in the other domains of wake up, grow up, or clean up. And it really largely depends on your cosmic address. It depends on your sphere of influence. It depends on the systems that you're engaged in and surrounded by. But, I think the connective tissue here is in making that fourth step after wake up, grow up, clean up is then show up. And show up really means, use this wonderful integral mind that you've spent years or even decades cultivating to actually make a difference, to actually exert influence, to exert pressure, to use the integral lens to sort of identify those hot spots and those leverage points, but don't allow yourself to get trapped in holistic thinking or even holonic thinking. Use it to help identify what types of skillfully partial actions are required within a given set of circumstances or what have you, whether it's political, ecological, whatever it may be. So sort of a spin on, think integrally, act locally. And those local actions are really gonna, depend on who you are as a person, what your typologies, your passions, your interests, your proclivities, your shadows,
it's that, but it also, this invitation to let this koan really work us, I think is a hugely profound thing. In other words, immediately we need to get into action in various ways. And so we become more politically engaged. We try to be much more artful in the way we talk with the extended family members that might be Republicans and support destructive policies. In the current dynamic, unfortunately, even though obviously an integral view is not left nor right, we have a degeneration of the Republican Party such that we have temporarily the convenience of a kind of good versus evil dynamic going on. And it's necessary for good to prevail. And so really leaning in and being an active participant and getting off of our dissociative superiority to postmodern culture so that we can join together with other people and modern, but by no means is it strictly about postmodern culture.
That's right.
Modernists are allies too, but there's a huge opportunity and this necessity for us to begin to have conversations across the boundaries of worldviews among modernists, postmodernists, and integralists. Because everybody in that category, being world-centric, is capable of rational discourse and tending to be profoundly contemptuous of one another. So the necessary bridging is that we can get a little strength in our capacity to do that. For one thing, we have a political necessity of coming together so that we can effectively cooperate and prevail against the way that our amber culture has kind of been co-opted by the corruption of the red impulses of the leader of the Republican Party. So we have a moment in which clearly there is a temporarily oversimplified good evil differential going on. When we have, you know, this week our dramatic moment with the amazingly articulate kids from the Parkland Marjorie Stoneman Douglas is at high school. The marvelous new voice in the gun control debate. It's another one of those things that's clearly, hey, stop killing us. You know, it's kind of like your kids telling you this is a simple issue, and we have politicians obfuscating and avoiding and talking their way around these issues.
It's kind of amazing, right? That the GOP actually owns all of the branches of our government right now, and it's within that climate that the NRA is getting rapidly delegitimized right now.
It is
fascinating. I don't think that would have happened if Hillary Clinton was president. I don't think Me Too would have, reached its saturation point the way it has if Hillary Clinton was president. So in a sense, having Donald Trump as this, and I don't mean to offend any sort of, conservative, more conservatively aligned listeners here, but, there's something to having at least having the perception of a common enemy in a certain kind of sense, where Trump is really galvanizing these very, very rapid and, very fundamental shifts in our culture, in our society right now, to the point where it actually feels like we're sort of living in a new 60s right now. And it's happening in all of these, various, aspects and dimensions of American life. And
it is, and it will become that if the postmodernists, the integralists, and the modernists can get into fruitful dialogue.
That's right. And and Terry, I'm gonna include the traditionalists in that too, because for me, I believe that the alienation of the traditional level is one of the reasons that it has metastasized in such a nasty way. Because Green basically loves.
There are conversations that you can have with a principled conservative like Jeff Flake, or the kind of conservatism that David Brooks articulates are absolutely, valid voices. And in fact, many of the people who are Trump supporters are embodying a lot of important human virtues. These are hardworking, self-responsible people who are arguing for this self-responsibility versus culture of dependency and sympathy for victim psychology and so forth. Those are people who are absolutely necessary cultural partners in the larger view of things. But in the temporary view of things, there's a necessary victory. The good guys have to beat the bad guys at the polls, and we have to, and that will create an opportunity for dialogues among the different warring factions among the good guys.
That's right.
And that's where our integral understanding gives us an opportunity to convene discourse of a different level. A big chunk of what I've gotten into in my book, and you'll see this in the later chapters, the book lays out the principles of this situation in part 1, and it offers my original thinking in part 2. And one of the key things I get into is one group that I call the innovators, who are really creating the future more dramatically than anybody else. These are people like Elon Musk and Larry Page and Bill Gates and thinkers like Nick Bostrom or Sam Harris or even John Mackey, who are essentially modernist in their sympathies and are really trying to reassert rationalism. That's what Pinker's book is you know, in the stream of, and it is the mainstream of our public intellectual life. It's modernist. But there's a postmodern stream that's much more marginalized, but with which everybody has to reckon. And it's raising the bad news that I voiced earlier. And these are people like Derek Jensen and Carolyn Baker and Michael Dowd, who we know expresses this point of view. And it's a radically ecological point of view. I call these people the ecologists, and they're arguing for the worldview I kind of articulated. This whole issue of having overshot carrying capacity, you know, that there's a good evil that has to do with defending the future of the diversity of life. And even, you know, Jensen is like a revolutionary on behalf of non-humans. Connie Barlow, Michael's wife, is just worried about trying to help trees migrate before global warming causes too many of them to go extinct. The horrific levels of wildfires that are going to happen when we have huge die-offs of major, you know, species of dominant trees in various regions, and the implications of that, desertification. It's, you know, so these ecologists are facing the thing that nobody wants to look at. They are absolutely essential participant in any meaningful conversation about our future. The whole transhumanist sympathy that pervades the conversations among the innovators can't be purified and countered except by really being in conversation with those ecologists. But neither of those groups is doing what we do, which is to make subject object and really look at our own meaning making and derive all the lessons and wisdom that come from the great spiritual and wisdom traditions of mankind. We need to be at that table too, in a whole different way.
Absolutely.
And so I think that there's room for a kind of evolutionary activism, a different kind of participation, which defines activism very, very broadly. You know, I talk about in the system, against the system, and around the system. That and most of our activities as integralists have been around the system. Educate girls in the third world, develop fossil fuel alternatives. These things would change the world dramatically without seemingly being involved in politics directly. So there's lots of room for that. But in this moment in time, we're under a kind of, what could have more moral force than the fact that what takes place just in the next few years of our lives, but certainly in our lifetimes, will have implications on an evolutionary scale for the whole future of life and of humanity and of the fates of our descendants. What could have more moral force? And yet that tends to make us so heavy. It tends to draw us. It's such a bummer to think about it.
Yeah.
That we and yet our study of our integral life practice wakes us up to the fact that we have got to find, I have this one liner I often use, things are far too serious for us to lose our sense of humor.
Right.
that if we're to meet this with what's best in us, we're going to have to find all the benefits of that awakening such that we can be joyous, wholehearted, undiminished, not only undiminished, but even more profoundly joyous participants in the world ahead.
Yeah. Yeah, it's well said. And, you know, and it's interesting, Terry, because even with our audience, I mean, I can show you, you know, some interesting analytics where, you know, we've got a very passionate, very engaged, very hyper intelligent audience. I mean, so often our audience is
smart.
You know, their developmental lines are beyond, you know, the people on camera even. And,
right.
You know, really, really impressive group of people that we've had for, you know, these last 15 years or so. And even within this group, I mean, it's interesting. I'll release a piece of content that is, you know, about climate change or what have you. And the number of clicks, the number of total views on any given piece of media is way down when you compare it to, you know, Ken Wilber giving some, you know, mystical pointing out instruction that you can immediately locate in your upper left quadrant. You can immediately hold on to it. It lands in a way that the climate change stuff, again, it's so abstract, it's so big that even in the integral
and it's such a bummer.
And it's a bummer. That's right. It's depressing.
Yeah.
And there's no, you know,
we've got to find our way to, we're made inauthentic by our avoidance of what we don't want to feel.
Absolutely.
We become heroes by being capable of being with what's hard to feel, with all of what uplifts our spirit and brings forth what's best in ourselves. Now, how do we stay in that together? You see, Corey, that's an integral practice, and that's an interpersonal practice. A big part of what I get into in the latter part of the book is the fact that this koan, it wasn't given to you alone or me alone. I can't respond to that except in relation to others. So it's us who have to respond. So it's we together are in that contemplation of that impossible question. And we damn well better be politically engaged and be activists in certain ways, but also creative people going around the system. That's going to be most of our activity as integralists. That's where our imagination goes. Just pouring more fire on this sort of stuck political dynamic is not necessarily the most skillful, although voting is a moral responsibility. And getting your friends who might be getting apathetic and cynical to get off of that and get into the voting booth is a part of, I think, your moral responsibility.
I think we've learned our lesson, what apathy and cynicism can do. The damage.
And Russian bots, you know, all of us who loved Bernie and got irritated with Hillary and then got trolled by the Russians to get even more polarized and to not support Hillary and vote for Jill Stein in a swing state.
Yep.
Have some thinking to do.
Absolutely. I call it zone 4 hacking, Terry. That's exactly what's happening is our zone 4, the outer of our lower left, is getting hacked by foreign influences. And that's causing, you know, what that zone 4 is basically the container in which these conversations organically arise. So
that's right.
Facebook. Exactly. When you have millions of bots that are repeating basic, you know, fake news, legitimate. I mean, you know, this is where the term fake news was actually coined. It was literally, you know, Macedonian teens putting in, you know, the Pope endorses Donald Trump. I mean, 100% illegitimate news systems. When that gets pumped into people's feeds, it gives people permission to think out of the bounds, to think outside of that Overton window. And what ends up happening is the entire Overton window actually shifts to the point where these, you know, I deal with these conspiracy theories on Facebook. Hillary Clinton has a disease from literally eating the flesh of babies is what a lot of these people
Some people actually think that's real.
You know, and it's like
no, it's not funny. I'm being amused, but I'm indulging.
Well, we got to keep the levity.
We really do.
You know, and meanwhile, Zuckerberg is, you know, trying to hack our dopamine centers so that every time we get a message, you know, it's like pulling a slot machine and we get that little charge. Fox News is trying to hack your amygdala and make you as fearful and pounding on your amygdala as much as it can so that you're always in that reactive defensive state. And we are in the most mediated world right now that humanity has ever experienced. And we're only just now beginning to suss out some of these, you know, largely unconscious factors and influences that are shaping our minds with or without our consent.
At a time where the locus of control through which the most effective defense is no longer in the hands of a responsible party.
That's right.
So it's a particularly poignant thing.
Yeah.
Now I want to respond to that question that Marge.
Yeah, we've got 2 questions. So what we'll do, Terry, is I'll read these to you, and then you can respond. And for anyone who's on with us, we have 1 hand raised. So right now we have 2 Q&A questions, 2 written questions, and 1 hand raised. If anyone else has any questions, again, if you're watching on integrallife.com/live, there's a link right underneath your video player. Click that link. That'll bring you into the Zoom app. It's a free download if you don't already have it. That'll allow you to ask questions, make comments in real time with us. You can either raise your hand, which tells us you want us to turn on your camera, and then you can ask your question in real time. Or you could submit your question through the Q&A, and then I'll read them to Terry just like I'm about to do. So what we're going to do, Terry, is we've got 2 written questions in the Q&A. I'm going to read those to you first, and then I'm going to call on our attendee who's raising their hand right now, Marjorie. So let me ask the questions, and then we'll call on Marjorie.
Okay,
so
terrific.
The first question is actually Marjorie's as well. I'm not sure if she has 2 questions. So I'll read this. Dear Terry, is there a difference between sacred activism and a more egoic desire to want to make things happen through efforting or manipulating others? What are some markers to help discern when we are in alignment with source or acting from ego?
Well, my experience is that there are many such differences, except that as you grow, you discover that there's no perfect purity. And so there's a great play by, I think it's by Jean-Paul Sartre, called Dirty Hands. And the plot of that play is that there's an old activist, revolutionary, who's been at it for years and years and years, and he's in his, I don't know, late 50s or 60s. And then there's this young, and this young guy who's a real dynamic leader, and he comes in with his girlfriend into the same activist cell, and the young guy doesn't want to compromise. He doesn't, he just wants the pure revolution. He's very doctrinally pure. But then what develops is the old guy, who's willing to make compromises, has a different level of character, and the young guy's girlfriend falls for him, and they have an affair, and he's enraged, and he ends up murdering the old guy. The fact that his accusation of the old guy was that he had dirty hands because he was cooperating with the power structure, and then he ends up with the dirty hands of having committed the murder. That this is a world in which we're all going to have dirty hands. So there are egoic motives that are going to be recruited by anything that we are intending to do, and you have to just bring your own intelligence to the impulse that you have to do something constructive has motives that are angry. We can get into a kind of rage at the stupidity of some of the people in power, and then our anger and our rage can motivate our activism. But fundamentally, what's really drawing us into this consideration is our care, a deep and profound care and responsibility, and what's morally best in us. And if we're operating from that, from what's essentially love, from an empathy and a care for life itself and for other creatures and other people that draws us into being of service, then what we're going to be doing is going to have a fundamental health. And will there be some egoic motives, and will you feel a little morally superior to somebody else, and will you notice yourself sometimes falling into lower level patterns? You bet you will. That you will have dirty hands. It is given that you will have dirty hands. There's no way around it that you'll have dirty hands, and you should absolutely pay attention and purify your orientation, because your effectiveness is going to be undermined by all those egoic motives, because our shadow is most apparent to others. I like to say sometimes that your shadow, you know where your shadow is? Your shadow is printed on your forehead so that everybody else can see it.
Oh, God,
not you.
All right. I'm doing the rest of my broadcast like this.
Yeah, exactly. It's so uncomfortable, even though I teach this. It's true as much of me as anyone else. So that fundamental humility and that commitment that comes from a deeper place just has to keep renewing itself. Yeah. Will you end up discovering that you're coming from a less than perfectly pure place? You bet you will. And you'd better pay attention to that and care about that and clean your act up as you go. But don't let that prevent you from getting into action. We can't, the pursuit of an unattainable purity is only going to render us even more ineffectual. We've got to realize that we're a profound majority in this country, and yet a much less developed minority is holding all the power because they keep their eye on power, and we keep our eye on all kinds of other topics. Well, we have a moral responsibility to pay attention to that.
That's right.
The summary of the strategy I offer in the book, I call it the ancient strategy. Step one is like those ancient admonitions: become a sage, become an enlightened presence. And step two is like the ancient sages of China: gain the ear of the emperor. Let the sage advise the emperor. So caring to actually acquire power, not speak truth to power. That's the postmodern way of being. Oh, the noble guy who's, you know, taking a risk and standing up to power. I mean, yes, that is virtue to a certain extent, but what would be even more virtuous would be for us to coherently get beyond this reactive position and actually become capable of holding power and using it wisely. So that the fact that this is a practice in which we will all always have to mature is evident. But part of, I think, what's going to evolve in the integral community is that we're going to become a community not just of cognition and abstraction, but of service and action, because it's just inevitably an implication of what we understand. If you've really downloaded these maps and you are a practitioner, you're going to become more and more and more engaged in activism. With everything we love at stake, how can you be a practitioner and not be part of what's restoring wholeness to a fragmenting world? So that's only going to intensify. And therefore our culture of discourse is going to be a culture about of figuring, not just figuring, the mode of figuring out has a place, but being with is the more foundational level of things. Just not avoiding, not abstracting and going into a figuring out mode as a way of avoiding feeling, but letting our way of engaging these things be grounded in an embodied relationship to them. Then you're a trustable partner.
Yeah. No, it's well said, Terry. In my experience, it's not the size of your ego that gets you in trouble. It's the opacity of your ego.
Nicely put.
You know, the path of growing up is literally, by definition, a path of ever increasing ego. And my greatest role models throughout my entire life have always had big, beautiful, enormous egos. The difference is they've done their work to make their egos a little more transparent, right?
And it's also that they're somewhat identified with more than their own separate interests.
That's right. Well, that's what I mean. So when you've done the work to clean up and to wake up, your ego becomes more transparent, and then you're not identified with the egoic structure. You're actually identified with sort of that unshakable mountain, behind it all. And you're then able to use your ego in very deliberate ways, in very skillful ways, so that you can, again, don't have an allergy to power, amass more power so that you can make a bigger impact on this world. And that's I think,
absolutely
key. All right, next question, David Satterley. I'm not sure if it's a question or it's a comment. Let's see. David says, the environmental and global existential crisis that we're entering truly calls for a more pervasive acceptance of responsibility far beyond individual transformation. I want to see more coherence to making collective community, societal, global change making. I don't think you're going to get us to disagree, David.
Yeah, well said. Is my main comment is right on.
Yep.
And this acceptance of responsibility it's an open-ended matter that has infinite depth. And that sometimes we substitute our strategy for change making for a process that deepens our very presence. And, we have to become a moral witness to one another. We have to begin to draw each other. It is as if we live in a village that's slipping into the sea, and everybody is acting as if it's not happening. So how is it that we relate to that? Well, we have to have conversations at a different level. We have to, now, you can kind of exhort people like, hey man, we're slipping into the sea, we got to talk about it. And maybe you begin to discover that they develop a kind of there's some meme that develops that makes them immune to that's simply drawing attention to the fact that you're slipping into the sea doesn't work anymore. Mm-hmm. So you've got to become more artful, but you can't stop talking about the fact that the village is slipping into the sea. You
That's
live
right.
there.
That's right.
We're in this lifeboat together. So finding a way to bring the appropriate level of seriousness in a way that reflects the joyous nature of being alive. I mean, even if we're among the last generations to be able to live under the kind of circumstances we're living under, that, it's still important for us to enjoy the beauty of the sunset and the gorgeousness of the day and all 1,440 minutes in it, and really have that fundamental, all the things that are attractive in our superficial culture are expressions actually of virtues. Mm-hmm. A certain amount of sexy sass and joie de vivre and playfulness and humor, and these are the stuff of being an attractive, radiant, awakened being, and those qualities have to be brought into the very serious matters that we are confronted with. And this is a driver for our growth. We together are going to have to go through a stage transition, maybe several stage transitions as individuals and culturally. And that's a high pressure matter. That's under titanic pressures that you actually go through a stage. It's revolutionary. That's why I use the word revolutionary in the subtitle of my book. A stage transition is a revolutionary transition in our whole human experience. So how cool is that? We get to be alive when so much is at stake, and what it requires is a stage transition. We understand enough to understand some of the principles involved, and we're obviously flawed individuals who are not the highest of all human exemplars, but we can care, we can have a real conversation about that, we can enter into this in an honest way. That's fantastic. We've won the lottery to be alive at this time when things are intensified so much. Like this is real life. We got the call from Central Casting. Here we are. Wow, we've got a starring role in the evolutionary drama. We can look back 13.8 billion years. We can look forward and see these intense implications, and we can participate.
Yep.
Wow.
Yep. I think there's a Chinese curse for that.
Yeah. Right. Interesting.
Right, so I'm going to call on Marjorie. So I'm going to promote you to panelist, and I'm going to unmute you. Hello, Marjorie. Can you hear us?
I don't think she's unmuted.
Yeah, it's not. Yeah. There we go.
And there goes the video. Okay, here we are.
Hey, Marjorie.
Hi. Yeah, thank you for answering my question, Terry. I have another question that has to do with, you talked about being the sage, or in my case, the wise woman, and living here in the Bible Belt and wanting to make a difference, wanting to be active, do some sort of sacred activism, and yet also being in my retirement years now and not being able to keep up with the younger ones and not knowing exactly what I can do in the world to be contributing and being doing something. And so it has to do with kind of discerning how to either be or do. Is it a question, is it an either or, either I'm being something or I'm doing something, or is being something doing something, or is any of this making sense?
Well, I mean, you're a smart person and you're asking questions that have a fair amount of sophistication. But I think that the important thing is for you to find ways to get, to some degree, that's a little abstracted. And what's really going to be important is for you to find ways that you can actually engage relationally. And, you know, that ends up being a tricky thing. What is it that you're, you know, given where you are geographically, given whatever opportunities there are in your local area, given whatever financial constraints you have to operate under, given your particular mix of capacities and talents, your strengths, you know, relationally and socially, and your weaknesses, all those things, there's going to be places where you can effectively give life and give energy to others. And the ways that you can give energy that are actually constructive, that get your energy flowing in relationship with other people such that you're making a difference and you're giving a gift that represents a change, that represents a positive shift. And to some degree, a shift from abstractly being, you know, internally involved into actually doing in some way. Those are going to prime the pump and get you further into it. That's going to be the ways of being. And will you be tested? You know, yes. You know, are you going to be around a bunch of Trump supporters who are difficult to be around? Probably. Yes. Are you going to have to find ways of developing new skills relationally and finding a way to be a presence of love and peace in a way that's, you know, genuinely felt by other people? Of course, all that's going to be demanded, and it's going to grow you. But that's what you want. You know, you're a practitioner. You want to be being the change you want to see in the world. And so that's going to ask you to change. It's going to ask you to go beyond your current pattern. And that's, you know, to have the integrity and humility to welcome that and to value what that brings. That's kind of your secret weapon.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, and does it get to the point, do we ever reach a point where we start to become to where we are declining in our abilities or capacities? And
as you get older.
Yes, as we get older.
Certain capacities decline, but others increase. I mean, there's a role, for elders, but right now we have a situation, you know, the old role was if you were old, you just got honored and they asked you for your opinion in the tribal council. And now we've got a situation where there's more ageism and younger people don't have respect and they're not listening to you. So how do you function as an elder when you have less energy and, you know, more physical limitations and so forth? Well, it's always a unique, you know, it's unique to, you know, it may be that you function with other older people as maybe there are meetings of people in your community that you can welcome people to your house and entertain them in a way that makes that attractive and draws them into something that they benefit from. And through that, they become more of a presence in the lives of other people. You know, we don't all have to, there are many good things that need to be done in the world, but just because it is needed doesn't mean that it's your job to do all of those things. You have to notice. There's that old classic statement from Joseph Campbell: "Follow your bliss."
Yeah. And
it points to something real, but Andrew Harvey, who founded the Institute for Sacred Activism and is kind of focused on this, he's argued, no, don't follow your bliss, follow your heartbreak. You know, in this time in which so much is being destroyed, follow that. And in the book, I propose another modification, because you have to know what you're good at and what brings you alive and where your unique soul expression is taking you. You can't just ignore that. So you have to follow your heartbreak and your genius, I say. And then I point out that it's relational with your friends. So it's follow your heartbreak and your genius with your friends. And so finding ways to have productive friendships with other people who have something in common with, even if it's limited, such that you magnify your efficacy by being in relation to other people. And so that you're actually giving energy in some meaningful way, and keep trying. You try something that doesn't work, try something else. Try something else. Keep, you know, gently, patiently maybe, but keep experimenting, because we do have to find a way. You know, it is as if you're on the submarine and the loudspeakers going, all hands on deck. You know,
Wow.
it's that moment. So we all have to find our way to something new. And you're something new. I can't prescribe. I don't know exactly what it is, but there's something. There really is.
Do you think it's wise to try to convince the younger ones that they need to listen to the wise ones?
Yeah, that'll never work.
To the elders.
Well, I think that will begin to happen, because at a certain point, the impacts of, you know, we're already in a situation in which most blue state Americans are knocked back on their heels. Everybody's sobered. It's like, holy cow, I could see liberal democracy actually being lost. I could see human civilization coming unraveled. I am beginning to be humbled and scared. And that's going to become a wider perception. Red state America is not there yet, but at a certain point, they're going to connect the flood in Houston and the hurricanes in Florida and what happened in Puerto Rico with the larger narrative. And everybody's going to realize, holy cow, we're in this lifeboat together. And at the point where we begin to get that it's real, that we're in this lifeboat together, and that if we fight to the death, we sink the boat for everybody, there's going to be some new kinds of conversation. Wisdom will try to reassert itself. Wholeness has telos. Fragmentation doesn't just proliferate and only bring out the worst in people. It brings out the worst and the best.
That's right.
And the best is going to resurge. And so wholeness is going to have its day. It already is.
Thank you.
Yeah. I think if you read my book, you know, that's coming out shortly, you'll find a lot of reflections that will be relevant, you know, just as kind of teaching prompts and
I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Marjorie.
Thank you.
All right. So let's put her back. So then we have one other, I would say it's a sort of a mixed critique and some praise in this next one. From Clint. And I've got a couple critiques of the critique here too. So I'll just read this out loud. I'd like to suggest that you step farther away from your postmodernist roots to a much more neutral and consequently integral point of view on politics. Those of us who are disgusted with politics in general recognize that both Trump and Clinton are just playing a power game, and neither was worth listening to. Disidentify with any level, line, etc., and adopt the appropriate point of view while simultaneously vetting that view through all of the others. That said, I commend you for the progress that you've already made wading out of the green muck that postmodernism became. And I've seen this sentiment quite a bit, particularly around some of the episodes that Jeff and I do, where, you know, we often come across as promoting liberal values over conservative views. And in the one sense, that's an unfair comparison because, you know, values and views are very different from each other. All values should be included. All views should be negated as you move to successive sort of levels of development. But to me at the same time, and we don't have the benefit of actually interacting here with Clint, we're just going by his written word here. You know, to me, a lot of this falls into the same type of apathy and cynicism that we're actually trying to challenge right now. Where I think that there's this sort of idea that, well, because neither of these guys are integral, we should, you know, look at both of them with sort of equal suspicion. Or maybe because both of these are, you know, both of these individuals have a certain relationship with power, albeit very different relationships with power. I just don't trust the power conversation anymore. And therefore I'm looking for a candidate who's not interested in power.
Except those people aren't candidates.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, and this is, you know, the old Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy of, you know, the person who wants to be president should never by any, you know, should never ever be allowed to actually be president. But this is sort of, this is the world that we're in. And it's a world that is composed of power. And when it comes to power, just like when it comes to violence, certain types of power are better and worse than other types of power. And I think that when it comes to looking at sort of the political landscape from an integral point of view, yeah, I'm liberal leaning because I tend to agree more with liberals when it comes to things like healthcare. When it comes to a lot of these sort of fundamental values that I hold, I see that better represented in the Integral Party. That said, Clint, I'll be happy to hop on a call with you and spend 6 hours, at least talking about all of the things I don't like about the Liberal Party, all the ways that I think millennialitis has become boomeritis on steroids, all the ways that I think in certain ways the postmodernists and the liberals are leading us into, an evolutionary cul-de-sac. I can hang with that conversation, but right now, at this very moment, when I look at the political landscape and I look at the condition of one party versus another, it's very easy for me to find the level of discernment and, again, skillfully partial judgments that I can make in the moment where I can say one candidate is clearly superior to the other. Now, all of that said, I'm also open to the wisdom of, Jesus Christ, I know my knowledge and my understanding of the universe is scratching the surface of what is real. And I can, like I said earlier in this talk, I don't think that the Me Too revolution, that this delegitimization of the NRA, I don't think these things would have happened under Hillary Clinton. So from an evolutionary point of view, I would say I clearly think Hillary Clinton was by far the superior candidate to Donald Trump. However, I think Donald Trump is the evolutionary, candidate that this world actually needs in order to sort of break through this wall that has been sort of calcifying over the last several decades.
Well, I think also what I would like to say, I don't know if this is the Clint I know so well, but whoever this person is, that the integral thinkers have to get over their ego of being so proud of themselves for having gone beyond postmodern limitations and defining themselves through a rejection of postmodernism. We're very aware of the limitations of postmodernists defining themselves through rejecting modernism. We need to look in the mirror and make subject-object and recognize that our detesting of postmodernism can be a huge limitation on our ability to show up in a fully moral and effective way. And that I would identify myself as being part of what Steve McIntosh and Carter Phipps in their Institute for Cultural Evolution call a future left. And I think that there's a necessary counterpoint with a future right that has some really important contributions. So I'm not actually advocating for a permanent victory of left over right. But in our country as we have it now, Trump is I do think that he's a provocation for evolutionary growth, just like you were saying, but he's also an embodiment of all 10 of the 7 deadly sins.
Yep. And they called the Obama the Antichrist.
Yeah, no, we've actually got the Antichrist archetype in play. So the idea that as an integralist you can sufficiently just reject Trump and Clinton. Clinton's not even relevant. Clinton hasn't been relevant for over a year. The fact that you're talking about Clinton means that you're full of shit because you're distracting from what's real, and you've got to take that on in that one way. Now, you may be very wise and have some things to teach me in some other respects, but the fact that you're trying to reduce this to a he said, she said, as if both sides are equally wrong, shows that you're more attached to a position than you are really investigating how to be love in action in a way that makes a difference. So there's something to wake up from. There is a way in which you're missing the boat. Clinton's completely irrelevant. Mm-hmm. She's gone. She's a book author. She's a retired, formerly influential person. To speak about them now is to betray a position. And we got to get beyond having opinions. We've got to get into action, love in action, practice in action. The implication of a truly integral point of view is to be a practitioner, to be involved in a self-transforming participation in reality. And that self-transforming participation in reality is not just in the upper left, it's in the lower left. We have to be doing that together. And so we have to challenge each other. So I accept the fact that you're offering a challenge to me. I'll hold up a mirror and offer a challenge right back. That Integral has too often been relegated to being simply kind of an ally of modernism. Because we recognize the limitations of postmodernism, we end up being much more sympathetic with modernist points of view. And so we end up also being sympathetic with mental analysis and clarity and seeing pattern and so forth. But the way that we've been most effectively critiqued is for our tendency toward abstraction. And I think that we're in a moment with the situation that we face, that's what I've put forward, that requires something more of us. So I hope that you'll, hold your nose if that's what it takes and read my book and really engage with these arguments, because I think they'll take you to a different and deeper relationship to the issues that are really fundamental.
Mm. Yeah, well said, Terry. And let me just say, Clint, thank you for this, because I really enjoy conversations that have a little bit of dissonance to them, where different points of view can actually rub against each other and, maybe actually sort of shape each other, refine each other. So I appreciate the pushback, and Terry, I appreciate the pushback that you offered as well. I think that this is, we can't shy away from these kinds of challenges, and we can't shy away from taking every opportunity to become a little bit more clear in terms of our own orientations, how we relate with each other, what we sort of, see in each other and project onto each other. And I think it's all good. So thank you both. That's it for questions, man. This has been fun.
This has been great. And we've gone for a good chunk of time, an hour and a half. So more than 2 hours. Yeah.
Yeah, so just to remind everyone, we're going to be doing this every month. Terry's going to be joining us. I think we're slotting out the last week of the month, each month. And I hope you guys can join us next month when we do it again.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Corey. Thanks, everybody, for joining us.
Yeah, thank you, Terry. This has been great, man. And I will talk to you soon, my brother.
All righty. Take care.
Bye, everyone.